Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel the hidden history of the American consumer. And this isn't just some dusty history lesson. Oh no. This is a story that directly explains your relationship with money, why you spend, save, and even worry about it the way you do right now. So let's start with this idea right here, because the economic journey from the end of World War II to today, well, it's not at all what you'd expect. It is a wild ride of booms, busts, and massive psychological shifts that are still pulling the strings of our world today in ways we barely even notice. Okay, so our story kicks off in 1945. The war is over, the world is celebrating, but behind closed doors, policymakers they were terrified. They were bracing for a total disaster. Instead, something absolutely incredible happened. I mean, think about it. The war was over, but the biggest fear wasn't another war. It was economic collapse. You've got 16 million soldiers coming home, all needing jobs. And the memory of the Great Depression, it wasn't just a memory. It was a ghost haunting every single decision. They knew they had to do something big, something drastic, to keep the whole thing from spiraling downwards again. So how do you turn millions of soldiers into millions of consumers? Well, they basically hit three giant go buttons at once. First, they made money practically free, keeping interest rates near zero. Second, the GI Bill was a game changer. It let veterans buy brand new homes with almost no money down. And finally, they opened the floodgates for consumer credit, basically teaching an entire generation that borrowing wasn't just okay, it was the American way. And this, my friends, created the perfect storm. See, during the war, factories were building tanks, not toasters, so the public was absolutely starved for stuff. At the same time, all the hardship of the 1930s had accidentally forged this hyper-efficient industrial machine. All that pent-up demand and productive power just needed a spark. And cheap credit, that wasn't just a match, it was like pouring gasoline on a bonfire. The result? An absolute explosion of consumption. I mean, just look at this number. Between 1945 and 1949, that's just 5 years. Americans bought 21 million new cars. Manufacturing had basically ground to a halt during the war, and then bam. And it wasn't just cars, not by a long shot. In that exact same 5-year window, they built 7 million new homes. Now, this isn't just an economic statistic, this was the physical creation of the American suburbs as we know them, a complete transformation of the country's landscape. This quote from Frederick Lewis Allen just captures the change on such a human level. It wasn't about abstract numbers, it was about millions of families filling those brand new homes with modern marvels, refrigerators, washing machines, TVs, stuff that was pure science fiction just a decade earlier. And here's the most important part, the absolute key to this whole era. This wasn't just a boom for the rich. It was an era of shared prosperity. For decades, the poorest Americans saw their incomes grow just as fast as the richest. The entire country was rising together, and that forged this incredibly powerful, baked-in expectation. Your life is supposed to get better, and it's supposed to look a lot like your neighbor's. But that foundation of shared prosperity, the very thing the boom was built on, started to crack in the 1970s. The economic party wasn't over, not yet, but the guest list was about to become way more exclusive. Yeah, the 70s were a real shock to the system. All of a sudden, you've got runaway inflation, high unemployment, and for the first time, really serious competition from places like Japan and Europe. The economic good times were suddenly gone, but that cultural expectation, that idea that everyone's lifestyle should be improving and roughly equal, that was still stuck deep in everyone's head. Then the economy did boom again in the 80s and 90s, but this time, it was a completely different animal. The economic pie got bigger for sure, but the way the slices were being cut up had changed dramatically. The growth was real, but the money was flowing into totally different pockets. And the numbers, they're just staggering. Between 1993 and 2012, the top 1% saw their incomes jump by over 86%. And what about the other 99%? Just 6.6%. The new wealth from this boom was being almost entirely captured right at the very top. This created this really dangerous new dynamic. Let's call it the big stretch. People saw the crazy lifestyles of the rich on TV and everywhere they looked. That old expectation of shared prosperity was still there, whispering in their ear, but their paychecks weren't keeping up. So what's the only way to bridge that giant gap between expectations and reality? Yep, debt. This little story about Joe and Peter just nails the problem for millions and millions of families. Peter, the manager, feels like he deserves a life that's not that different from Joe the banker, because that's what his parents' generation experienced. But the economic reality had totally changed. To keep up appearances, he has to stretch and stretch and stretch, taking on massive debt to finance a life he can't actually afford. And you can see the result right here. The explosion in personal debt was just mind-blowing. The household debt-to-income ratio, which had been stable for decades at around 60%, more than doubled to over 130% by 2007. The big stretch was pushing the American middle class right to the breaking point. So this all came to a head in 2008. The giant rubber band of the big stretch finally snapped, leading to the financial crisis and kicking off this whole new era of economic and political turmoil that, honestly, we are still living in today. You know, the crisis wasn't just a market crash. It was the moment the Wile E. Coyote economy, which had been running on the thin air of debt for decades, finally looked down. It was the painful reckoning between that 1950s dream and the cold, hard 21st century reality. And think about what happened next. You have the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Brexit, Donald Trump's election. I mean, they all came from totally different ends of the political spectrum, right? But they were all fueled by the exact same core feeling. The system isn't working for people like me anymore. It was a collective shout of, "Stop the ride, I want off." And this right here is the heart of our modern problem. So much of the anger and division we see today comes from this fundamental conflict. Our minds are still clinging to the memory of a shared prosperity world, but our bank accounts exist in a winner-take-all reality. That disconnect between our memory and our reality is fueling so much of our frustration. Which brings us full circle. History can really feel like it's just one damned thing after another. The real question for us now is whether this moment of turmoil is just another turn of the wheel, or if that massive disconnect between our expectations and our economic reality has finally pushed us into a chapter that is radically and permanently new.